Rabbi Akiva, Aimer, Oreis, Vureis, Kedushas Hashem, V'kelel Malchios in Kedushas Hayom. Rabbi Akiva tells us the halacha is that we are to combine Malchus Shamayim with the sanctity of the day, the here and now. Keilel Malchios in Kedushas Hayom. This, in fact, is the halacha on Monday in Musaf. The first of the three Malchios will be said together with Kedushas Hayom. Rabbi does not reject the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. But although Rabbi does not reject this opinion of Rabbi Akiva, that Malchios and Kedushas Hayom are to be combined, Rabbi says something very, very, very different. Rabbi Aimer v'heichon Aimra l'Kedushas Hayom im haMalchios Aimra. Whereas Rabbi Akiva had told us that we should combine the Malchios with Kedushas Hayom, Rabbi came and told us no. What we are supposed to do is take the Kedushas Hayom and connect that to Malchios. What is this agreement over here between Rabbi and Rabbi Akiva? It's clear that according to Rabbi Akiva, the constant is Kedushas Hayom, the variable is Malchios. According to Rabbi, the reverse is true. Malchios is the constant, the variable is Kedushas Hayom. What is this? To explain this disagreement between Rabbi and Rabbi Akiva, I would like to tell you about two different Jews in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Needless to say, the first man that I ever met in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania was my own father. My father lived in the house of the Chafetz Chaim, and he spoke with a Ragat Ilui. He had seen the majesty of the Rabbeinu Shalom shining through these faces. Es Hashem Aleikecha Tiva L'Rabbeis Talmidei Chachamim. The best way for us to perceive a presence of the Rabbeinu Shalom is Es Hashem Aleikecha Tiva L'Rabbeis Talmidei Chachamim. The Rabbeinu Shalom, His own majesty, shines through the face of these Tzaddikim and Ge'onim. The challenge facing my father more than anything else when he came to America was to acquire the skills, the perspective, the breadth that would enable him to take that majesty that he had seen and experienced, that familiarity which he had with the realm of the majesty of the Rabbeinu Shalom, and somehow bring that in to the here and now, to Kedushas Hayom. This is the opinion of Rabbi. Rabbi says that over here, where is it that you go and you say the Kedushas Hayom, you combine it with Malchios. Why? Who was Rabbi? Rabbi was the son of Reb Shimon ben Gamliel. Why was he called Rabbeinu HaKadosh? What was so holy about Rabbi? Gemara Yerushalmis tells us, Shekidshei Aviv L'Shem Shamayim. He was Kadosh Merechem. Before he was ever born, his life had been consecrated. He was born into a state of Malchus Shamayim, and his challenge in life was to somehow take this Malchus Shamayim with which he was familiar and think of a way of reaching into the here and now, into Kedushas Hayom. I'd like to tell you about a different Jew in Pittsburgh called Dr. Mark May. Dr. Mark May never lived with Chavetz Chaim, and he never talked with a Ragachava Eloi. Never did any of these two things. Last time I was in Pittsburgh, Dr. May, president of Hillel Academy, comes over to me in shul right after Havdalah, and he says to me, Rabbi, you know, I always thought that you ought to get yourself a deviated septum operation. How would you like to come with me to my office now? So I tell him, Dr. May, you hold hours, like Tzai Shabbos. He says, for your father's son, I would do quite a lot. So he took me to his office and he looked me over, and he gave me the glad tidings that I would not have to submit to the knife. After hearing the good news that I would not have to submit to the knife, he said to me, Rabbi, I would like to explain to you why I put on tefillin every morning. And this really roused my curiosity, because, as was just mentioned, this man never met a Chavetz Chaim, never spoke with a Ragachava Eloi, and I wanted to know why in the world it is that this man is putting on tefillin. What is it that's motivating him? He took me to an enormous diagram of the inner ear, the nose, the throat area. And he said to me, do you know that for sound to retain its volume when it travels from air into a liquid, that sound has got to be amplified by 30. Fine. I want to show you a picture of the ear canal. And he showed me the ear canal, and he says, you see, it is at this point when the sound is transmitted from air into liquid. And there's an inner ear device here, and that amplifies the sound. Guess by how much? He said, by 30. He says, right. That means that someone up there knew that equation. That is why I am putting on tefillin every single day. Dr. Mark May, like Rabbi Akiva, is about tshuva. For him, something very, very different. His perspective is completely different than Rebbe's. His perspective is what do you do with Malchias? Connected to Kedushas Hayayim. To him, he starts off with the knowledge of Kedusha in the here and now. His challenge after seeing the presence of the Rebbeinu Shalom in the here and now is to somehow connect that up to the very majesty of the Rebbeinu Shalom. Like Rabbi Akiva himself, he first saw the presence of the Rebbeinu Shalom in the here and now. We all know the story of Rabbi Akiva with the water and the rock. Like this Dr. May, who first saw the Rabbi Shalom in the inner ear, Rabbi Akiva saw it also with the water and the rock. He saw the presence of the Rabbi Shalom in the here and now. Therefore, Rabbi Akiva came and said, Heichan Oimra L'Malchias Kedushas Hayom. To him, Kedushas Hayom is the starting point. His challenge is to work from there towards Malchias. Yitz Hashem, Monday, all of us are going to be working on combining the majesty of the Rebbeinu Shalom with the sanctity that we might have perceived in the here and now. Some of us will be like Rabbi, starting off in the domain of the Rebbeinu Shalom's majesty, reaching to the here and now. Others, Baalei Tshuva, like Rabbi Akiva, will be starting off with a presence of the Rebbeinu Shalom perceived in the here and now, and try to reach from there into the realm of the Rebbeinu Shalom's majesty. In Zechreinos, we happen to confront one of the central contradictions of Rosh Hashana. Rosh Hashana happens to be the only holiday that we have that has no roots whatsoever in Jewish history. Rosh Hashana is Hayom Haras Eilam. Rosh Hashana happens to be based on an event common to all of mankind. V'hayom Tchilas Ma'asecha Zikaron L'Yom Rishon. And yet, it is the only holiday whose meaning is kept a careful secret. In Chumash it does not mention that it is Yom Hadin, only alludes to it. The Torah takes the highly unusual step of mentioning that there is a Yom Tov and keeping us totally in the dark about what the significance of that Yom Tov is. The secrecy of Rosh Hashana is even more accentuated when we take a look at the story in Nehemiah, when it tells us about how the people returning from Bavel were familiarized with the fact that there was a holiday on that particular day. Then it says, they read, Vayikru Rosh b'Torah Selikim. They read that was explicit. V'som Seicha. And somehow, those who were the custodians of Torah Sheba'al Peh gave meaning to those words whose literal dimension revealed very, very little. Vayovinu. And then they became privy to the esoterica, Vayisabolu. All of this carefully evading any mention of what the meaning of Rosh Hashanah is. Why is this being kept such a secret? What is the Torah talking about over here? The location of the enriched uranium? Why is it that the Torah goes so out of its way to keep such a secret over here? Dafka that, which seems to be the most universal of all of our Yom Tovim, is the one whose meaning is kept as a guarded secret. Its universality is celebrated throughout the Yom Tov. Take a look. Kedushas Hashem, sanctity of the Rabbi Shalom. Sanctity, by its very nature, is exclusive. And therefore, sanctity of the Rabbi Shalom every day of the year is expressed with the words, Ata Kodesh v'Shimcha Kodosh, because you are holy, therefore, Ukdoshim b'chol yom yahalu chasela. Therefore, this sanctity is the exclusive domain of they who themselves have achieved a certain degree of loftiness. What do we say on Kedushas Hashem on Rosh Hashanah? Scrap the exclusivity. Instead, what do we say on Rosh Hashanah? On Rosh Hashanah we begin Kedushas Hashem kol ma'asecha v'moschal kol ma'asher b'rosav yivrahucha v'yasu kulam aguda echos. Instead of speaking of the exclusivity, which is practically part of the definition of Kedusha, we say the exact opposite. We speak of the universality of the Rabbi Shalom's Kedusha. Look again at Kedushas Hayom. Kedushas Hayom throughout the Yom Tovim. How do we speak of the sanctity of the holiday? Baruch Atah Hashem Mekadesh Yisrael v'Hazmanim. What do we say about the sanctity of any holiday? Those who themselves are possessed of a certain sanctity by virtue of consecrating their lives, Mekadesh Yisrael v'Hazmanim. They, because they have achieved some degree of loftiness, they can appreciate a glimpse of your own. What do we say in Rosh Hashanah when we speak about Kedushas Hayom? Again, the exact opposite. Baruch Atah Hashem Melech al kol ha'elam kulei. You, whose kingliness extends to the entire planet, Mekadesh Yisrael v'yom hazikaron. As if we're issuing a disclaimer and saying that exclusivity defines Kedusha all the other days of the year. But today, universality is the tone throughout. If it is so that universality is the tone throughout, why the guarded secret? It's very, very often asked why it is that it's time, rather than the Torah, Brias, Ha'olam, we find two separate and independent accounts of the creation of man. We have, first of all, Vayomer Alekim Nasa Odom B'Tzalmenu Kidmusenu. This parasha appears on the 6th day, shortly before Shabbos. The Rabbi Shalom says, let us bring man into being. And in this account of the creation of man, all of the essentials seem to be mentioned. First of all, that he is in the image of God. Second of all, where he takes his place in relationship to the rest of the creation. Also, it is mentioned by Yivra Elikim Adam, that Salmai, Zochal, Unekeva Bara'aisan. It's mentioned also that this man comes in two different types. All of these are mentioned in the initial account. The Torah then progresses from the sixth day. It moves on to Shabbos, and then, for some reason, we have a second account of the creation of man. Now, it's true that in the second account we find more depth as well as more detail. Vayitzer Hashem Elikim es ha'adam ofo min ha'adama, vayipach ba'apav nishmas chai, vayodam lenefesh chaya. Here we are taught that the fact that man is created in the image of God is a product of the fact that the Almighty exerted into man of his own life force. Zohar HaKadosh tells us that that's why the Pasuk employs the metaphor of breathing. To breathe is to exert of your own life force. So there is more depth to this concept of Tzelem Elokim. This concept of image of God takes on a new dimension in the second account. As far as man coming in two different types, male and female, here again, more depth, more detail. Here we are told something much, much more. It is not good that man live in isolation. Let me therefore bring a helpmate into being for him. And on this point too, like that of the image of God, more depth, more detail. However, simply presenting more depth and more detail does not justify two separate accounts. The Torah could have simply given us one complete account from the start. What's the purpose of dividing Liyas Ha'adam into two separate accounts? The Gemara in the Dorim that tells us machlekes. It says in Malay Brisi Yaimon V'Layla Chukei Shamayim V'Aretz Lei Samti. Would it not be for my ongoing covenant, I never would have brought the earth and the heavens into being. So there's a machlekes in the Gemara exactly what covenant this refers to. There is Rabbi Elazar that tells us that this refers to the covenant made at the time of theophany at Sinai. And Rabbi Yehuda rejects that particular opinion and says, no, it is not the covenant of theophany at Sinai, it is instead bris milah. Now obviously this is an extremely important difference of opinion. If your opinion differs about what the meaning of this pasuk is, what does the covenant refer to, then what you are actually differing about is what is the precondition for bringing the world into being. Hayyin halas eilam. What was the precondition for bringing the world into being? Rabbi Elazar says it's Maimar HaSinai. Rabbi Yehuda says no, it's Bris Milah. Now this is of course intuitively obvious that we have a machlokas which covenant it is. We are not referring to that which ceremonializes the covenant, but rather to the substance of the covenant. What is, in fact, the substance of the covenant of Bris Milah? What is the covenant? Hishalech lefanai v'heyei tamim. Become my servant. The Rebbe Shalom tells Avraham Avinu, observe the mitzvahs. If the covenant of Bris Milah is the acceptance of mitzvahs, then for what purpose is Rabbi Yehuda rejecting the opinion that says no, it's theophany at Sinai? Aren't they talking about the same thing? In fact, Rabbi Yehuda himself that rejects Rabbi Elazar and says no, it's not Sinai, it's Bris Milah. He says Shkula Milah connected kol ha-mitzvahs. Milah is the equivalent of all mitzvahs, because the pasuk says at the time of theophany at Sinai, Ki al pi advarim ha'ela karati itchem bris. There's in reference to all of this that I've made with you the covenant, meaning Bris Milah. So if Rabbi Akiva concedes the point that Bris Milah is nothing but an acceptance of the commitments made at Sinai, why is he so eager to reject Rabbi Elazar's opinion that says that the that the covenant that's the precondition for bringing the world into being is theophany at Sinai? We know that in the entire Chumash, there are only 5 places where the Ben Shalom enters into covenants with human beings. We have, first of all, the covenant with Noah, 2 covenants with Avraham Avinu, covenant at Sinai, and another covenant again when we're on the verge of entering Eretz Yisrael, Koras itam bris ba'arvos molad milvat habris asher koras itam be'chorev. I think it's obvious when you look at these covenants, first of all, that the Rebbe was not very profitable with covenants. There are only 5 of them here in the Torah. And second of all, you can see that these covenants all seem to be at crucial historic junctures. We have the bris with Noach. We have, this is after all, an extremely crucial point. Then with Avraham Avinu, Sinai, the verge of assuming full nationhood, coming into a land. If we find that there are, in fact, so few covenants in the entire Torah, why does the Rebbeinu Shalom enter into 2 separate and distinct covenants with Avraham Avinu? He has with Avraham Avinu first a bris ben habsarim, and mentioned almost immediately later. I know in time the 2 are separated by 20 years, but in the Torah they're practically next to each other. The bris ben habsarim and then the bris milah. Why do we have 2 separate brisas? If you'll take a look at Parshas Bereshis, at the 2 accounts of the creation of man, you will see that the 2 of them really deal with 2 separate topics. There was no repetition, nor in fact any overlap. Let's take a look. Nasa Odom Betzalmenu Kidrusenu V'Yirdu B'Dgas Hayom U'Beif HaShamayim U'Vadahenu V'Chol HaOretz V'Chol HaRemes HaRemes Al HaOretz. We have over here the Torah telling us the human species is being brought into being. And we are told that this human species is made in the image of God, that comes in 2 different types, male and female. But the first account is limited to one and only one topic, and that is characteristics of this human species being brought into being. The halacha is, in Dinei Nefashis, in dealing with capital cases, ma'aynin al ha'eidin. 2 people come into Bezdin, and they say they have testimony that could lead to ending the human's life. Ma'aynin al ha'eidin. Bezdin calls them in and starts intimidating them. What is it that Bezdin says to intimidate people who come with an account that can end another person's life? We tell him, Odom Yechidi Nivra, before you tell us even one bit of that story that you have in mind, I want to explain something to you. And that is that when it came time to bring this species into being, the Rebbeinu Shalom made only one, to let us know that to save one Jew is to save the world. Converse is also frighteningly true. To terminate one is destroying the entire world. In other words, we're telling him that all that exists. Tell him, listen, young men, with your testimony. Before you tell us this story, keep in mind that the earth and the heavens, the fish and the fowl, and all the beasts, everything that you see in front of you, all of their creation was justified for simply one human being. So before you tell us any story that could end up terminating a human life, bear in mind that all that you see in front of you, the fish and the fowl, the birds and the bees, the heaven and the earth, all of these were brought into being for the sake of one individual human personality. If you will take a look at the second account of Brias HaOdom, you'll see that here we are not in any way talking about the human species. We are here instead talking about the creation of the individual human personality as the very culmination of the entire Bria. And everything that exists now, including in a sense the human species in itself, were brought into being for the sake of the individual human personality. In the first account, when the species was spoken of, it said that the human species was made that Tselem Elokim. Tselem Elokim is a term which refers to potential. The Horaya, the proof of it is that even that generation, which was described by the Torah as Ra Kol Hayom, thoroughly evil, the Torah said to kill one of them is liable to death penalty. Why? Now it is obvious that Ra, totally evil, and image of God have to be mutually exclusive terms. When the Torah speaks of Tselem Elikim, it is speaking of a potential. And even that generation which is referred to as nothing but evil, that generation too is called Tselem Elikim. When it speaks instead of the account of the creation, of the individual human personality, here we say something else. Vayitzer Hashem Elikim es ha'odam ofo min ha'adama, vayipach ba'apov nishmas chayim. The Rabbi Shalom exerted into the human being of his own eternal life force. And because of the fact that this human being possesses within himself of the Almighty's own life force, he is therefore the culmination of the Bria. He is so much the purpose that it is worthy that other adjustments made to suit his subjective needs. Hence, Leitei Heyei Sa'adam Levadei, the Rabbi Shalom says, I'm going to address his subjective needs. It is, after all, for this creation that everything else was brought into being. If you will take a look at the two brisos that the Rabbi Shalom made with Avraham Avinu, you'll see something interesting. All of us know, of course, that the purpose of the Avos HaKadoshim, the purpose of our patriarchs, is to rebuild mankind after all of the devastation that he wreaked upon himself in the 10 generations from Adam to Noach, and then the next 10 generations from Noach to Avraham Avinu. The first bris that the Rabbi Shalom enters into with Avraham Avinu, it says, Vayomahu koras Hashem bris es Avraham leima l'zarecha nasati. The Rabbi Shalom made a covenant with Avraham Avinu in reference to his descendants. In other words, we are dealing with a collective covenant, and in this particular collective covenant, Avraham Avinu stands as the representative of an ummah. Koras Hashem b'risas Avraham leima l'zarecha nasati. Avraham Avinu stands here as the representative of the descendant nation. It is at this point that the Torah confirms that Avraham Avinu has succeeded in rebuilding the human species to the perfection that it had been made on that first Erev Shabbos. We now have a group of people who can really be called the Tselem Elikim in the highest sense of the word. We now have Avraham Avinu too has succeeded in creating such a collective. You'll take a look at Bris Milah, on the other hand, you'll see something very, very different. Bris Milah does not have Avraham Avinu representing the Jewish people. We have here something very different. Habris beini ubeinecha, I'm making the covenant with you, Avraham, ubeini ubein zarecha. It is between me and you, and it is also between me and every single solitary one of your descendants. Here we have Avraham Avinu not representing the Ummah. Here the Rabbi Shem enters into one covenant with Avraham Avinu and commits himself to entering into the same covenant with all of his descendants. It is at this point that Avraham Avinu has succeeded in rebuilding the individual human personality as it was described immediately after Shabbos. Now we have Vayipach ba'apov nishmas chayim, that every individual of this species created by Avraham Avinu is inherently eternal. He is the bearer of the Nishmas Chayim, the eternal life force of the Rabbeinu Shalom. How do we say, Vayipach ba'apov Nishmas Chayim, he exerted into him of his own life force? How do we say he is inherently eternal in this second edition man? How do we say second edition man, man as recreated by Avraham Avinu? How do we say that he is inherently eternal, that he bears a Nishmas Chayim? That's what we call Kol Yisrael Yesh Lahem Chayim La'olam Haba. Every Jew is considered to be inherently eternal. God forbid it's his to lose. But he starts off with that particular Nishmas Chayim. When Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Elazar had a disagreement about what is the precondition for bringing the world into being, is it the covenant at Sinai, or is it instead the Bris Milah? this is what the disagreement was. Rabbi Lazar said that which bris is the precondition for the creation of the world. Rabbi Lazar said, it's Maimon Osina. That covenant, that establishes the Jewish people as a collective group that holds a covenant with God. Comes Rabbi Yehuda and says, no. Not for that was the world brought into being. Rabbi Yehuda says, no. It's bris milah only. It is that covenant that celebrates the creation of the individual human personality as the only legitimate purpose of creation itself. If you will take a look at the account of Zichronos, you will see that it parallels this particular progression. Zichronos starts off that you know everything that was brought into being. Zehayom tchilas ma'asecha zikovoy liyom rishon. This is the day that celebrates the bringing of the world into being. We start off with the most absolute universality conceivable. Atazoicha masei oilum ufayket kol yitzurei kedem zehayom tchilas ma'asecha zikovoy liyom rishon. This is the day in which all of mankind was brought into being. And then Zichronos progresses, and it again tells us about ourselves. After telling us about ourselves as the legatees of Adam Orishain, what does it then tell us? It then speaks about another universal event relating to all mankind, Noach. And how does Zichronos culminate? Zichronos culminates Va'akeidas Yitzchak Hayom Barachavim Tizkar Lazare Shal Yaakov Baruch Atah Hashem Zocher Habris. That which started off with total universality ends up with this total exclusivity. Paralleling this progression from creation to the covenants of Avraham Avinu. Akeidas Yitzchak Lazare Shal Yaakov Barachavim Tizkar Baruch Atah Hashem Zocher Habris. Zichronos parallels this particular progression which we just now saw from Bria Sa'adam, the creation of the world, to the covenant of Avraham Avinu. Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot deal with Klal Yisrael as a particular ummah. And as long as we are an ummah, as long as we are a nation, there happens to be room for other nations as well. This is in fact Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot talk about as an ummah. And as long as all we are is an ummah, there is room for other ummahs. We have just witnessed a progression in Bereshis, which is eloquently repeated here in Zichronos, from creation to the covenant. And this particular progression is one which endows us with the responsibility for all of mankind. As long as we are one ummah, there is room for other ummahs also. If we are only Jews, as we are on Pesach, on Shavuos and Sukkot, there is room for other ummahs. But we are here not as Jews, but as the exclusive legatees of Adam Harishan, when we are here as mankind itself. Atem kuyim Adam. By definition, there is no room for anyone else. Atem kuyim Adam. This is something which necessarily excludes. Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot, we are a nation. There is room for other nations. When we instead speak of ourselves as the culmination of that progression, starting at the creation of the world, culminating in the covenants with Adam Harishan, there we have the ultimate of Zichronos, endowing us with a responsibility for all mankind. This is the essence of our Zichronos of Jewish history. We are endowed with the responsibilities of all of mankind. Reciprocally, the Rabbi Shalom promises us that he will maximize our impact by setting the borders between the states accordingly. Shofros. When we turn to Shofros, we're actually looking at a very, very sharp instance of mixed signals. Shofros, ki nisra inish b'veisha gonach v'hodler yoder. In sounding the shofar, we are told to moan like we are sick through the shofar. We are then told to wail like we are bereaved again through the shofar. Here we are, moaning like the sick, wailing like the bereaved. And what does the Torah tell us? Ichlu mashmanim shsuman takim ki kodesh hayom la'adonenu. Al tayatzvu. Don't be upset. The Navi tells us, don't be upset. Go, have a festive meal, drink, enjoy yourself. You hear this? A moment ago we were told to moan through the shofar as if we are sick, to wail through it as if we are bereaved. And then, after doing this, b'leisha gonach v'hodel yolil, we are then told to celebrate, to have a festive meal. What is all of this about? Shofros, we know, are based on the puzzle. Tikul d'fanai b'shofar shalayim k'dei she'ez kolachem akedas Yitzchak ben Avraham va'al li'ani aleichem ki'ilu akadetem atzmachem. Chazal tell us, blow the shofar. I will remember the ordeal of Yitzchak, and it will be considered as if you yourselves endured that. This is a puzzling statement on quite a few accounts. First of all, Ritva points out, explaining why it is that we are invoking over here Schusavos, and what relationship the blowing of the shofar has to the Schusavos. The Ritva tells us something fascinating. The Ritva tells us that sometimes we benefit from the merit of the others only if we ourselves have something very much in common with them. You want to benefit from the Akedah of Yitzchak, blow the shofar, and in that way you will benefit from the schus. What in the world does blowing of the shofar do to provide us with a common experience with Yitzchak Avinu? Second of all, why suddenly are we interested in this pretense to having something in common with our others? We know that every single prayer that we offer thrice daily begins by invoking schus others, the zeicher chasdei others. And we do this without any pretense to having anything whatsoever in common with our others. Why suddenly do we have to have this pretense to having something in common with our others? It is, of course, worthy of our curiosity to know why it is that the schus, the merits of the ordeal of this particular binding of Isaac should be attributed to Isaac, to Yitzchak, rather than to his father, Avraham. What? We're used to thinking of the Akedah as one of the trials to which Avraham Avinu rose. Here we say, the challenge is blow the shofar, and in this way it will be considered as if you played Yitzchak's role in the Akedah. And the truth is, this is not the only place where we have Chazal attributing the merit of the Akedah to Yitzchak rather than to Avraham Avinu. Chazal tell us on the pasuk, "V'zachalti es brisi Yaakov, v'ach es brisi Yitzchak, es brisi Avraham ezkar, ha'oretz ezkar." I will remember my covenant with Yaakov, and the one with Yitzchak, the one with Avraham I'll remember, and the land itself too will be remembered. So Chazal asks, why does this pasuk so artfully omit the word zechira, remembering from Yitzchak? V'zacharti es brisi Yaakov, ach es brisi Yitzchak, v'es brisi Avraham ezkar. Answers the Sifra, because of the fact that Yitzchak Avinu's ashes are right there on the Mizbeach. No remembrance whatsoever is necessary. So, here too we find an attribution of the schus of the Akedah to Yitzchak, And look how sharply. Here it says that Yitzchak, in a certain sense, stands taller, not only than son Yaakov, but even than father Avraham, because he alone has this merit of the Mizbeach upon which he was bound. And in what way is his chus so much more concrete? The Gemara in Shabbos tells us that at the ultimate Yom Hadin, not the annual, but the ultimate Yom Hadin, the Ribono Shel Olam comes to Avraham Avinu and says, Avraham, Banecha Chatu, your descendants have gone astray. Avraham says, okay, Yimachal Kedusha Shmecha, wipe them out. Ribono Shel Olam goes then to Yaakov and says, Yaakov, Banecha Chatu. Yaakov says instead, he says the same thing rather than that Avraham said, Yimachal Kedusha Shmecha, okay, went astray, so wipe them out. Then the Ribono Shel Olam comes to Yitzchak and says, look, it looks like the old man and the youngster don't know what to say. Let me try you, Yitzchak. Yaakov did not know. Avraham did not know. Let me talk with you, Yitzchak. Let me try you. Yitzchak, banecha chatu. Yitzchak says, banai. Below banecha. B'shon she'omdu lefanecha har Sinai v'amru nasa v'nishma. Amarta b'ni b'chorei Yisrael v'achshav shechatu karasa lahem banecha. Yitzchak says, my children have gone astray? When they stood at Sinai and said, we'll obey these orders, we'll accept these ideas, you called them my son, my Bechor, my Yisrael, my firstborn. Now that they go wrong, you suddenly call them my sons. And then the Gemara tells us how Yitzchak Avinu engages with Ribono Shel Olam in a very, very convincing debate, and the Ribono Shel Olam accepts his argument, and we win the day on the basis of Yitzchak Avinu's intercession. Strength. Avraham, who is chesed, says, wipe them out. Yitzchak, who's rachamim, compassion, like the patriarch of loving kindness, his grandfather, also says, what? Avraham, he also says, wipe them out. But Yitzchak, who represents stern judgment, he is dafka the one to spare us. Why is this? We know that after a person lives in defiance of the Ribono Shel Olam, his life does not attest to his inherent vitality. We know that at that point, his life is simply an expression of Ribono Shel Olam's compassion. We know that metaphysically, the moment it's Rabu Avonosa, Neftam L'Misa. He's already gone. If he lives, it is by virtue of the Ribono Shel Olam's compassion rather than his inherent vitality. On the other hand, man who has already relented, repented, achieved that resolve so firm as to prevent a recurrence, dan tshuva, incorporated into himself real life, that man's life is bedin. That is real. His life attests to his own inherent vitality. His life is real. He lives by virtue of himself. He generates his own vitality. What this Medrash is telling us is that when the time of Din comes, the ultimate Yom Hadin, all that is relational will fall short of helping us. Avram's loving kindness, Yitzchak Avinu's compassion. On the Yom Hadin, the time of stern judgment, that's where you have to make it or break it in terms of reality. And then, only what Yitzchak himself has inculcated in us, that alone can guarantee our survival. The others need zechira. They need that the Ribono Shel Olam should somehow remember them. Somehow. Yitzchak does not need that. But nonetheless, let us take a closer look at this metaphor. It says, Afro tzavur al gav hamizbeach. Yitzchak doesn't need to be remembered because his ashes are right there on the Mizbeach. What's the meaning of this metaphor? All of us know Yitzchak was spared. What's the meaning of these ashes? Afro tzovra agav mizbeach. The use of the Vilna Gaon here is afro with an aleph rather than an ayin. Afro tzovra agav mizbeach. His ashes are on the mizbeach. What are these ashes? And again, in what way does the blowing of the shofar give us something in common with Yitzchak Avinu? What's that do? We say that we blow the shofar, and b'zchus, by merit of the fact that we've blown the shofar, we have something in common with Yitzchak's role in the Akedah. How does the blowing of the shofar do all of that? How does it connect us to the Akedah of Yitzchak? Granted, we now know why it is that we can't just invoke schusavos. After all, it's a Yom Hadin. You have to make it or break it in terms of reality. You can't just passively benefit from schusavos. Now, the important Av is the one of Yitzchak, the one who sees to it that we have to incorporate reality in ourselves and in that way exist. What's the meaning of this? How does blowing the shofar give us anything in common with Yitzchak? And what are these ashes on the Mizbeach? Rabbi say, there's a very, very frightening Zohar HaKadosh. Listen to what the Zohar HaKadosh tells us. The Zohar HaKadosh says, take a look in Chumash and you'll find that in reference to all of the Karbanos, the Rebbeinu Shalom is spoken of only as Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey. No exceptions. Any Korban you will find, it's Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey. Says the Zohar HaKadosh, do you know why? Zivchei Eleikim Ruach Nishbara. The reason it mentions God in terms of Yud Hey Vav Hey, the attribute of compassion, is because of the fact that the Korban's effectiveness is only from the standpoint of the Rebbeinu Shalom's compassion, Midas Harachamim. And Midas Hadin, the attribute of stern judgment, stark reality, looks askance at the idea of a human being who is himself guilty and instead brings an animal as the sacrifice. So the Zohar HaKadosh tells us, Zivchei Elokim, what is the korban which is effective even from the standpoint of stark reality? Ruach Nishbara, the broken spirit. Like Nishbar v'nidka, Elokim lo tivzeh. Midas Hadin does not look askance at a human being coming with a broken spirit and a shattered heart. Midas Hadin will look at askance at a human being who is himself guilty and comes in with an animal as his sacrifice. If you want to succeed from the standpoint of Midas Hadin, Zivchei Elokim Ruach Nishbar, a broken spirit alone, is the only thing that is significant from the standpoint of Midas Hadin. Medrash Vayikra tells us an interesting thing on this self-same pasuk. Medrash Vayikra tells us, Kol shepasal b'behema hichshu ba'adam. The more disqualified something is as an animal sacrifice, the more desirable it is when it is the human himself. Why? If an animal has only one broken bone, it's disqualified as a sacrifice. But a human being is only kosher when he's totally shattered. Kol shepasal b'behema hichshu ba'adam shene'ema zivchei elokim ruach nishbara lev nishbar v'nidke elokim lo tivzeh. From this Zohar HaKadosh and this Medrash, you see the following. 2 points. First of all, whereas Midas Harachamim requires that you bring a sacrifice, Midas Hadin requires that you become the korban. And it also tells us that what the Oila L'Reach Nichoach, what the most perfect sacrifice is to the Midas Harachamim, the shattered spirit and the broken heart, is to Midas Hadin. Therefore, what we really had on Har HaMoriah that day were 2 separate Akedas. 2 separate events took place on that mountain at that time. Avraham Avinu, his role as a man of Midas HaChesed was to bring a korban. Yitzchak, who is Midas Hadin, he, on the other hand, had to become a korban. Whereas The sacrifice of Avraham Avinu, whereas Avraham Avinu's role to bring a korban was never culminated, Yitzchak's role was indeed culminated. Zivchei Elokim Ruach Nishbara Nishpar V'Nidke Elokim Lo Tirzeh. What was this role that Yitzchak Avinu played? What was this shatteredness of heart that he experienced then? Take a look at Yitzchak on the Mizbeach. Here is the only person in the history of mankind who was raised as the precondition to God's presence on earth. He was raised in a world in which no one knew of the existence of the Rabbi Shalom, and the only hope for the continuity of God's presence on earth was the son of the house of Avraham Avinu. He was brought up as the precondition of God's presence on earth. And now, as he is bound on the Mizbeach and sees the knife in his father's hand, he now learns Yavesh Chotzel Nagel Tzitz Devar Hashem Yakim Ba'olam. He learns that no one is indispensable, everything is ephemeral, and all must yield to the only thing that is everlasting. It is at this moment that Yitzchak Avinu experiences the height of Hakaras HaNeichach, face-to-face confrontation between Creator and created, and all of the negation of created inherent in that particular confrontation. The experience that we have on Rosh Hashana is this. We have now on Rosh Hashana, when the shofar is sounded, we have the most trumpeted and imposing presence of the Rabbi Shalom of the entire year. And we have to have a dual focus at the same time that we perceive that trumpeted, imposing presence of the Rabbi Shalom. It is at that same moment that we are to be Maharher B'tshuva, and while thinking of the Rabbi Shalom's majesty, we must also at the same time think of how pervasive is our pettiness, how weak is our restraint, how little command we have over our own behavior. All of this against the backdrop of the most imposing presence of the Rabbi Shalom of the entire year. Tiku lachem, tiku v'fanai b'shofar shel Yaakov, k'dei she'ezka lachem akedas Yitzchak ben Avraham v'a'ale ani aleichem k'ilu akadechem atzmechem. The blowing of the shofar, the sounding of this alarm, trumpeting the presence of the Rabbi Shalom, the self-same moments that we are so terribly aware of our own fragility. This is the height of the Yitzchak experience. On Rosh Hashana we think not about the role of Avraham Avinu in bringing a korban, though that korban was his own son. We think instead about Hakaras HaNeichach, confrontation between Creator, created, and all the negation of created inherent in that particular confrontation. We sound the shofar, we instill in ourselves that charoda, that alarm, and in this way we experience that same negation of self that Yitzchak experienced when he, the precondition to God's presence on earth, learned that he too is dispensable, and his existence too is ephemeral. But let us stop for a second. Does Yitzchak's life really end on the Mizbeach? Is this what happens? That frightening confrontation inherent in which is his own negation, is this the end of his life? No. There's something very, very highly paradoxical. Although we think of Yitzchak as pachad, we also say gvura. We speak of him at once as the embodiment of fright, but we also see him as our very image of might. Where is this might? What type of might could a man possibly be possessed of after experiencing an ordeal that lets him know that his life can be quenched at moment's notice to make way for the Devar Hashem Yakim La'olam? Where is this might of Yitzchak's? The might of Yitzchak is something which we find a few parshas later in Chumash. Powerful Avimelech antagonistically confronts Yitzchak Avinu, and he challenges Yitzchak. He says to him, the water that you drink is not yours, the land is not yours. But what does Yitzchak do? He doesn't get entangled in any quarrel. No, he respectfully, gracefully bows out and walks away. A while later, powerful Avimelech comes to Yitzchak says to him, Yitzchak, I see that wherever you go, it seems that somehow produce comes springing out of the earth. Water comes out of the earth. Wherever you go, it seems to me that I'd like to come to terms with you, Yitzchak, because it seems that when you surrendered yourself on that day to Mizbeach, you became possessed of all of the strength of that Shechina to which you surrendered yourself. The Pachad was just the beginning of the ordeal. That negation of your entire existence was just the first step. You're possessed of all of the force of the Shechina to which you submitted at that particular day on the Mizbeach. We first let out the Yolule Yolul and the Geduche Ganach. We first moan like the sick through the shofar, and then through the shofar we wail as if we are bereaved. The reason we go from wailing to celebrating so quickly is because what we learned from Yitzchak is that on Rosh Hashana, what we really go through is a death and a rebirth. We experience a death and a rebirth, one immediately after the other. We must totally submit, as Yitzchak Avinu did. It is at that moment that we see how inconsequential we are, how pervasive is our pettiness, how weak is our restraint, how little command we have over our own existence, how at a moment's notice we have to submit to the Devar Hashem Yokim Olam and totally negate ourselves. That in that, out of that death, there is an immediate rebirth. And therefore we move from the Yolule Yolul, the Geduche Ganach, from that wailing, from that experience that reduces us to ashes, we go right from there to the party, Ichlu Mamtakim, Ichlu Mashmanim, Shsu Mamtakim, Ki Kodosh Hayom, Ladonei. Before ending, it's desirable to make a practical note. My ancestor, the Chod of Rabbi, once received someone, a chassid, who gave him a lecture on Tanya. He came to Russia, came to Poland. He told him some of his rather sophisticated thoughts about Tanya. The Chod of Rabbi looked at him and said, we Polish Jews want something that is the pole, something which is practical. Is there something that is practical out of all of this? There is a Gzera Shova here in Rambam. I'd like to make a Gzera Shova of two words. We know that in reference to other things we say Mandalay Dovash, but Mishnah Torah Dovash, certain things which elsewhere he does not dash and take a greater liberty in Mishnah Torah. All of us know that no matter what we say about this ordeal of hearing the shofar, this ordeal that reduces us to ashes, whether on the spiritual level or even the complex halachic level of fulfilling all of the different opinions, or any of these ordeals of the Yom Narayan, fasting Yom Kippur, none of these are difficult compared to simply learning how to forgive. Somebody inflicted substantive damage on your life, at home, at work. Halacha calls upon us to forgive. And this is a question which I always hear. People are always asking this question. It's a very, very complicated question. It's very hard to answer. If someone already has gray hair, there's an easy answer to it. A very easy answer to how to forgive. You simply think of all that you gained every time you succeeded in forgiving, everything you lost every time you failed to forgive. The question is generally asked by youngsters who don't have all of those particular memories. Listen to what Rambam says how to forgive. Listen to this. A person should learn to be self-effacing. He's saying this at the end of the last parak of Hilchos Deos. He's talking about the common, right? Speaking there about the problem of vengeance. And he's stating there the halacha. And in spite of the fact that our martyr president used to always advise us, don't get mad, get even. We know that the halacha is you're allowed to do neither. Not to get mad, not to get even. How do you go about doing this? It tells us, Rambam, what is the how-to of this? Listen. To those who understand, it's all nonsense anyway. This is quite an idea. To tell a person whose work was seriously damaged, perhaps whose family life may have been damaged by another person's spite, you say, Eitzel hanavinim hakoil havel. To those who understand, it's all a lot of nonsense. Let us make it Gzeir B'Shavua Hevel. From one place Rambam said nonsense to another one. Afal pi shetkiyas sheifa Rosh Hashana Gzeiras hakosuv. In spite of the fact that we perform the mitzvahs with total disregard for the reasons for the mitzvahs, here Rambam says, let's keep in mind the reason as well. Remez yeshbo. The shofar is telling us something very, very interesting. Uru yeshayim mishnaschem v'nirdamim mitadei maschem v'chipsu b'ma'aseichem v'chizru b'tshuva. It's an alarm being sounded, not to tell us something that we did not know before, but simply to remind us and refocus us, right? When an alarm is sounded, we drop whatever we're doing, and for some reason, no matter what it is we're doing, it all pales into insignificance in contrast to the alarm itself. V'chizru b'tshuva v'yishenim shnaschem v'nirdam mitadei maschem eilu hashokachim ha'emes b'havlei hazman. Rambam tells us that the shofar is here because of the fact that throughout the year we became focused on nonsense, on hevel. Let us make a Gzeir B'Shavua of hevel. Rambam tells us that how is it that we're to go about forgiving? Rambam tells us, She'etzel hanavinim hakol havel. To those who have the ultimate understanding, it's all nonsense. The shofar is sounded. We stand in the presence of the Rabbi Shalom's majesty itself. This in itself should endow us with the understanding that Eitzel hanavinim hakol havel. All of us then focus on the ultimate shofar, the one of Geula, quickly in our time. Hayom v'kol tishma.